Maggie?
Thank you. Maggie Ellis, Chair of CTA Retirement Committee. I think we all have the same interest of wanting clarity in terms of defining our credible contributions and making sure we do good education to both districts and to teachers on what that all means. There are some concerns, and I think the board has actually raised some of our concerns as stakeholder groups, and we have a meeting scheduled for later today to go over this exact same information. It feels a little like some of these regulations may go further than spiking, and we're just a little concerned about a few of them and have an interest in clarifying those things. The timeline that I see up there is concerning to me. It seems very rushed to go forward on December 8th. We would like to have an opportunity to really discuss what's in the report and refine it some more before it goes any further. And then I would also request that our preference would be that the full board hear it and it not just go to staff. Thank you.
Dave?
Thank you. Dave Walrath, representing Small School District Association. First, I want to thank the staff who've been very helpful working with us and others on these issues. Similar to the comment you just heard, we are concerned about the timeline. There are collective bargaining issues that are related to these regulations. We're not sure how fast we might be able to address those, particularly in the compressed time that we have, not knowing final state budget or other issues. So we'd like to see some flexibility on that and expect we might not make a July 1 date. We appreciate Member Hendrick's comment that there is here a tension in the regulations between a goal that we all agree with, I believe, controlling and eliminating spiking. But that creates a set of consistency which makes it difficult for local school districts to address some of their local priorities and how they craft and structure compensation. And Chair Dillon, your comment as well on that area, and the example of, as a school district, they might choose to do 2% off schedule with the whole intent of rolling that in next year into the base salary if the financial conditions are such to allow that. How do you then treat somebody who retires 1 year versus the next year under that type of structure? So these are some of the issues. We appreciate the opportunity to comment within the 45 days, and we will be doing that. And thank you very much.
Sal?
Sal Villasenor, Association California School Administrators. Want to echo the other two speakers' comments and say that we're in full support of what they just expressed to you. But let me start on the upside, and let me just say also that we want to thank the staff of CalSTRS for reaching out to us. We've had quite a bit of conversation around this area. It's not easy. It's a very difficult, sensitive topic. You're talking about 1,000+ school districts, talking about unique circumstances that each school districts are operating under. We're about to have the biggest change in the way school districts are financed. This financing system that we have in this state that's now upon us is like no other. That's going to have huge implications on how districts make decisions about how they compensate their employees, how they deal with negotiations. And this is not a change that's just going to happen overnight. It's going to go on for at least 5 to 6 years. So the work of this organization and how it measures what is credible, what is not, more importantly, how it makes a determination about whether or not an individual truly went out to spike their salary for purposes of gaining. Those are very serious conversations, and they have huge impacts. So I guess what I'm saying to you is that I want you to walk a slow path, be more cautious about trying to meet a deadline. I know I've told Ed in the past that we would like to see these implemented because the sooner the better, but at the same time, I'm also thinking that we want a product that we can all feel good at the end of the day that really moves us forward. My biggest concern is that we try to rush to a point and then end up with some holes we have to fix later. And this is a very sensitive discussion that we're having at the local area, at the local level as well. So we want to continue to work with you. We want to continue to give input, but we want you to recognize the difficulty this is having for us. The idea that Sharon was talking about and being concerned about providing too many options, therein lies the problem, that if you don't provide options, you're going to restrict the hiring decisions at the local level. So on one end, you have to have this balance where you might want to continue to provide options and provide some flexibility, and not be so restrictive that you're restricting the employer's ability to make employment decisions and thereby decisions of compensation at the same time. So we want you to be sensitive to that, and I think you will, but we want you to move very carefully as you move forward on these.
Thank you, Sal. Are there any further comments from any members of the board? I have Sharon. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm David Davini,
Hi,
and
Dave.
I'm a retired teacher and retired administrator. And I really think that these regulations are necessary, and I appreciate the work of CalSTRS in the clarification process. But I'm concerned about the process of audits that we're doing regarding compensation, and we CalSTRS did 15 different audits in one community college and 14 districts, and we have a large number of appeals as a result of that. As you continue to audit, you can expect that the number of appeals will increase if you apply the old regulations, which are subject to interpretation by the district payroll departments and staffs. And so what I'm cautioning, I think, is that the result of the audits affects real people who are caught up in adjustments being made to their retirement based on regulations that obviously were not as clear as they could have been, and maybe training that is not out there in the amount that is needed to get great data, great input that's consistent and that's accurate when it comes in. So I guess what I'm asking is that districts be given the training that's necessary so that we get good, accurate data in on a consistent basis. So thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Sharon?
Well, I was just gonna ask Ed about the time frame and kind of if you wanted to comment on some of the.
Yeah, there's a couple things. One is, I mean, clearly, I mean, we're not trying, we don't want to rush this, and we know what we need to have some further discussions, and you know, what's gone on up until now is completely sort of outside the normal rulemaking process. I mean, the normal rulemaking process is you submit a proposal, there's a comment period, there's a hearing, there's possibly another comment period. You know, I think partly, I mean, the board can go in a couple of different directions. It can decide to hold off on starting that process and hear this again in February based on whatever conversations we have with stakeholder groups and how we refine that. I think we sort of feel like we've had those conversations. Maybe we really want to get some formal comments in there, and then we can respond to those comments after the comment period, and if the comments are substantive enough that we have to change it, there will be another comment period. So it will go. It'll go in a cautious manner. The board could, you know, there's nothing magical about it starting July 1. It can be, if the board determines that it really wants to provide enough lead time to make sure that everybody has a chance to modify their practices, you know, that's an option for the board as well. It doesn't have to be July 1. It could be January 1 of 2015. It could be July 1, 2000. I mean, it could be any period of time you want. It's just there's this tension between trying to get the right regulations in effect versus trying to make sure that people have enough time to adapt to it. But we don't think that starting the process now is rushing it in any way. But if but the option is you can consider this to be a first reading and want to see it again in February and see what changes we make to it. It's, we could do it either way. It's entirely up to the board, but we don't think that we're pushing the process by starting the rulemaking process today.
Let me just clarify that, Ed's comment that what we've done is outside the normal rulemaking process. It's actually outside the formal rulemaking process, but it is very normal to interact with your stakeholders and people affected by potential regulations prior to putting anything down in paper. So I just wanted to know that we are, that the work that Ed and everyone has done is within the normal process.
Thank you, Brian. Terry? Were you, sorry, Sharon, were you done? Terry?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was going to ask a question about sort of the real relevance of the July 1 date, and I think you've already addressed that, Ed. I, have witnessed, and I think many of us have, the regulation process in action in other areas separate away from CalSTRS, and there's significant opportunity for interaction, as Brian commented, throughout the entire process. And the process could end up, even if it's initiated by board action today, it could end up taking 5 months, it could take 12 months, because the process is what it is, and there's plenty of opportunity to interact. So be my recommendation, and I would like to move staff's recommendation, but I would like to also have further discussion as to whether or not it should be a full board hearing.
All right. So right now, I think Terry's motion is that we proceed with the regulation formation. And that's basically it, because we still have to talk about whether we want to do the hearing or not. Is there a second to that motion? Alrighty. Is there any further discussion? I have Grant. Go ahead, Brian.
I just wanted to clarify that staff's recommendation was that there are 3 recommendations. I think one is on the timeline, one's on the regs, and the other is how we're going to treat compensation up to the effective date.
Right.
I think that was, I think we were looking for guidance on that.
Yeah, those are the 3 recommendations right there.
Okay,
It was just the
right, so,
first 2 were in the write-up.
Right.
yeah.
The first 2 were in the write-up. So Terry, do you want to include the interim process within your motion then? Or do you want to have that as a separate discussion? Your preference?
Separate, please.
Okay. So right now, it's just to move forward with the rulemaking process. I have Grant.
Thank you. My comment really had to do with the public hearing, but
Okay,
I will just say that I agree with Mr. McGuire's comments, that there's a lot of caution built into the rulemaking process, so comfortable going forward.
okay. My only comment, going towards the motion, Ed, it seems to me that as we move forward and we start to have formal hearings, that the comments that are made on record during those comments then carry more weight into what we do with them. So for me, I think moving forward is appropriate, instead of holding off and continuing to have conversations. I think I'd like to start having the concerns that our stakeholders might have on the record, and how we deal with them would be more formalized in that manner. So, all right, is there any further discussion on the motion then? All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say nay. Any abstentions? All righty, that motion is passed. Let's go ahead and go to delegation of hearing to the CEO. Grant?
Just based on the concerns I've heard from some of the board members and definitely from the stakeholders, I would move that the hearing come as an agenda item at the February meeting. I just think the board, or I don't want to speak on behalf of the board, but that's my motion, is that the hearing would be conducted by the board.
Is there a second on Grant's motion?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? I would just add that, this is a huge change for us. And I'm, very cognizant of the time that we have spent in the past on some of our hearings, but I think this one is really important for us to all be there, so I also agree with the motion. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Any abstentions? Alrighty. That motion passes, so the hearing will be in February in front of the whole board,
Okay.
and we will adjust our agenda accordingly. Okay, then the interim process. Is there any discussion on that? What do y'all want to do in the meantime?
We have, I mean, just, we have to do something, we have to give some direction to the employers about what they do in the meantime, so we feel this is probably the best approach. It's the least disruptive, and it provides some, we can utilize that guidance internally in terms of how we operate, and so we would recommend that approach.
I was just gonna say, that makes sense to me. I guess, you've heard concerns about just in the process of, communicating with districts in as much as we can to help make information clear, and obviously the concerns of stakeholders, making sure that
Yes.
moving forward. But yeah, as an interim, is there any issue with it not being in the recommendations of the write-up at all? It's on the PowerPoint, but not on the, Brian? I was looking at our recommendations in our board book, and it's just not included in there, so I didn't know if that was a,
So
Big
this
deal or
is the first time the public is pretty much hearing this, so is there any issue that,
for that third bullet point.
I think the issue would be if we went in the other direction. I think that, hearing that we're going to continue as is, if you will, or consistent with the guidance that we provided years ago, and we're, going to continue to interpret it as we have, and our compensation review unit and our audits are going to continue to operate. I think that's not
so basically we're saying we're
That's
going to continue doing business as we've been doing business.
business as usual,
usual.
and that doesn't concern me about a notice requirement. I think I would be more concerned if we were making a change that we
Changing
had
that.
properly noticed.
Alrighty,
And staff is looking for, just for your direction on that, so we can go ahead.
Michael?
I guess I'd like a little more discussion about the alternative. I mean, what would be the alternative?
The alternative is that we would give direction to implement regulations that are not yet in effect that, part of the problem, we're trying to, there's a variety of things in terms of things that have happened up until now that we need to, that people have reported things based on what we told people. We told them, we gave them direction and a guide, and we've never informed them that, that things are different now. And so I just think that it would be more disruptive and to suddenly change something in response to regulations that are still in the formative stage. And so if it changes again in the course of that, then we got to provide another set of instructions. And it seems like it would just complicate the process to have this sort of, because the regulation is still evolving, to say, here's what you need to do, but they haven't gone through any sort of rulemaking process to say this is what it's going to be. And it seems like it would just create more confusion, as opposed to just saying this is, but.
If I can, we looked at a lot of different issues, and I'm on your behalf, I asked staff some tough questions on the cost benefit and looking, trying to apply these regulations or any change in interpretation retroactively. I was informed by our member and account services and other folks that there would be significant administrative burdens and not a significant demonstrable recovery for the fund if we were to do that. That's sort of the first consideration I asked them. The second is we have to, we have audits out there. We need some clarity for where to go. And once we can give that clarity, because once the regulations are approved, they are law. So the education code provides that when you adopt regulations, they are law. And so we can say, okay, this is the law, and then apply that cleanly going forward. And so we considered all that. We had quite a few meetings and had them sort of analyze for you what the cost benefit would be and whether or not there was anything significant in that area to weigh in on the consideration. So really, it was efficiency, fairness, a clean line, because what we're saying is we're adopting regulations that have the force of law that don't currently exist.
I guess one of my concerns is that what I'm hearing is we've got 1,700 some odd districts, each of which may be at different stages in terms of their administration and compensation issues and so on and so forth. And I wonder whether there's a third alternative, which is to kind of consider a hybrid, that to the extent that for planning purposes, a particular district is comfortable with where things are, because you spend a lot of time talking with the stakeholders, and to the extent that they feel comfortable going ahead with some aspects of the proposed regulations that might be inconsistent with the existing regulations, that they be allowed to do so. I mean, I've seen this sometimes in federal regulations, that they say that even though the proposed regulations are not final, that to the extent that you comply with them, you will not be considered to be in violation of the law. I mean, is that an alternative?
That is, actually, if I may, there are not existing regulations. I need to clarify that. There's just.
Well, I mean, but guidelines and directives.
Guidelines.
Right. So to the extent that you want to wait until these become final, you're fine. And if you want to try to, and if you comply with the terms of the proposed regulations, even if they're changed before they actually become final, you will not be penalized for that either.
I think that's an excellent suggestion. I think that was one of the reasons that wanted to get these out there as soon as possible once they were in a good final form, so we could inform the stakeholders.
And I think as I said before, the more significant things that are being changed by the regulations relative to the guidance of providers in terms of types of compensation that used to be considered credible that wouldn't be. If they were comfortable with, trying to apply, let's say, for example, auto allowances, it would be a very easy change for them to make in terms of how they negotiate their contracts to make it non-creditable right away. And it would be consistent with the existing guidance as well as the prospective guidance. So I don't think we necessarily have to adopt it as a hybrid, because I think if you sort of say you can do it this way or this way, that will create confusion with the employers. But if we said, I don't think if they ask the question about, well, if you call, for example, an auto allowance a fringe benefit, it's not going to be credible, because by definition, fringe benefits aren't credible, so that's all they need to do.
Yeah, but I guess, are there circumstances where there would be a difference? And that's the only place where this matters.
Yeah, I mean, the difference would be, for example, if they say, and there's some contract that might say that we will pay you, we're going to pay a salary of X, which and it's salary, which includes an allowance of $500 a month. Then under the regulations, that would be creditable. But if they didn't want it to have to be credible, then they would just write in a different way, and we can provide, and that's not inconsistent with the existing guidance as well as the regulation, and we can communicate that. I think we just want to make sure that there's some clarity about, if you do this beginning July or whatever the effective date is, it is clearly not going to be creditable, and that there's no question about that. But I mean, it's just I think we can provide what you're talking about in our communication, and it would still be based on the guide and the directives. This is what's credible and this is what's not. And then when the regulations become effective, then this is what's credible and this is what's not. But if people want to start transitioning to that, they can do that even within this kind of interim process that we're talking about.
I guess the place where it might become an issue is if between now and the effective date, based on comments from the public, you actually change something in the regulation, and somebody based on this discussion was already in the process of complying with the proposed regulation as written. It gets changed a little bit so that what they did was not 100% in compliance with what the actual effective regulation says. That normally what I would see is a statement that says, to the extent that you comply with the regulation as proposed, we will not treat you as having been, being in violation of the regulation as final. Or we could say, don't do anything with respect to the proposed regulation, focus only on the guides and directives. And your compliance with a provision as proposed that gets changed doesn't give you any protection whatsoever. I guess that's my question.
Well, I'd have to defer to Brian about whether or not, somebody does something in anticipation of what might be, and then it turns out not to be that way, whether we can say, well, you acted in good faith.
I mean, that's exactly what you see a lot of times with respect to federal regulations.
Right.
To the extent that you acted in good faith, you're fine.
There's an excellent suggestion and comment. Under the California APA, I'd have to look into that, but if that's possible, I think that's an excellent guidance, and if we could do that with the board's permission, we will go ahead and do something like that as long as it's provided for in California law. But I can't, as I'm sitting here today, I can't tell you what the precedent is on that, or what type of instruction we could come up with.
Understood.
Sure.
I would just comment, this board member, I don't know if I'd feel comfortable with the language of a hybrid in the meantime kind of thing, because I think, even as I'm reflecting on these recommendations, the third point almost seems moot now that I think about it, in terms of, you're asking for a recommendation and we can approve it, but it just seems like it's more a matter of doing business, that we would use this process right now while we're waiting to kind
you're not
of go
getting
through
an
this
action.
process.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
so I would feel more comfortable with kind of the way we're headed.
I think, Michael, I think we can communicate it. I mean, I understand what you're saying. I worry about it creating more confusion to do it that way. I think that we can sort of do what you're suggesting, I think, within this, but we want to give it some more thought.
Sharon, in response to your comments, excuse me if I interrupted, staff does need guidance from the board on the interim process, especially audits. So we do need some guidance from you and on the interim process, and that's kind of why it's up there.
Tag in and
Sorry. In terms of, I guess I'm just trying to understand, why is that? Because if we've been using the guides and directives, so far, why does the board need to give a recommendation then to continue implementing it in the interim process?
Well, because the regulations, there are no regulations. There are
Okay.
guides and interim
Got it.
directives. We are, the law has not changed. The actual statutory law has not changed. These are regulations clarifying and defining the statute.
Okay.
So these would be operative, but on the effective date, but for audits purposes, prior to that effective date, they just need some guidance, because otherwise what the auditors may feel like they need to do is, if they feel like the regulation is a statement of the law before it's enacted, that they may need to audit as Mike was saying, the sort of the spirit of the regulations, and that we need to have a clear guidance for them to proceed forward until the regulations are adopted. Because as I said, the way I see it is the regulations are law, and that law doesn't exist right now. So that's why cutting it clean like that is my recommendation.
Jennifer.
Good morning, Jennifer Baker with the California Teachers Association. I think that the situation that we're running into is the creation of the regulations that we're going through now is much more of a complicated process than the previous regulations that we all worked on with penalties and interest. The parameters were very clear last time we went through penalties and interest. What we're finding is the more we're getting into these issues and they're unraveling more, we're finding that what's recommended and the processes that are being put forward can actually have far-reaching tentacles that get beyond spiking and that can have a major impact on what's done at the local level. So we're finding that it's much more complicated because the more we're having discussions, the more we're realizing that there could be other side effects and other consequences. That's very hard to communicate, and it's very difficult as well since we're in a holiday period, trying to get that feedback very quickly. And we do very much appreciate all the hard work that staff has been putting out, working to communicate with us. It's difficult trying to translate what's happening at the local level into the discussion of what's happening for regulations. And that's, I think, where the disconnect is happening, which is why we're really looking forward to having a much more intense conversation with staff. There are many issues that are being discussed in the regulations that would not be a problem at all. There are also many issues that could actually trigger other far-reaching consequences. So what concerns us is understanding what the guide and directives are going to be. If they are going to be directives that are from parts of the regulation that we would have major issues with, that could be a problem. If that's not what staff is recommending, it wouldn't be a problem, but it's understanding what exactly are we looking at and having clear direction until we address many of these issues so we can understand what do we absolutely not have problems with. If there are a few things that we need to work out, we can do that. But if some of the guides and the directives that staff is looking on moving forward with could become more complicated, that could make it more difficult for us to try to implement and deal with what's going to happen at the local level. So we're just trying to get a little more clarity as we move forward.
Yeah, just to sort of clarify, when we're referring to the guide, we're referring to the existing guide that was issued 12 years ago almost, and as well as the directives that came from that we sort of withdrew from availability on our website, but are still out there and people still refer to it. And so that's what we're suggesting. We're not suggesting issuing anything in anticipation of these regulations that reflect that. It's reflecting what the guidance that had been provided in the past through those two mechanisms.
And since the guide, there have been directives as laws have changed.
Well, nothing's really changed. The directives are really, we're sort of implementing, we're sort of consistent with the guide, yeah. Okay. I mean, there may have been some directives, but the law really hasn't changed that much. It's really just, they sort of go hand in hand.
Okay. Rich?
So let me make sure, I think my confusion is around what we do now. We had guidelines, but we sort of pulled those back. So when districts make decisions, do we have no guidelines for them at all now? What is, are we in the process of sort of muddling along here? I mean, is that the practical situation we're in?
That's why we're here today.
Okay,
Right.
so we have, okay, I'm gonna make,
You got it.
okay, so we have two choices. We can either try to, it seems to me that we can continue muddling for a while until we finish the regulatory process, right? Which is what we do now. That's status quo, right, is to keep muddling. Or if we wanted to somehow draw a line in the sand, we could have tried to declare these as emergency regulations and pass them immediately, subject to change down the line. The staff isn't recommending that. So it seems to me that our real choice is to sort of muddle along as best we can until we're done. And understanding that that's going to create problems in the world, right? Because we have been, in fact, it currently creates problems in the world because that muddling doesn't always go very well, as we know. And which is why we're doing the regulations, right? Is to try to put a little bit of a stop to that. I think there is probably always going to be some inherent muddling in this process, but we can try to reduce that. So it seems to me that given the fact that there are more issues around the regulations, I think, than we would like to imagine in the world, that drawing an immediate line in the sand is probably not a good choice. So if the question is, are we okay with you continuing to muddle for a little while longer while we do the regulations? It seems to me that the real answer to that has to be, yeah, we're okay with that because we really don't have any choice. or are choices small?
Yeah.
We can't sort of, I mean, if the alternative is to kind of pretend, hey, pay attention to these because we may be going this way, that would be useful to provide to districts, but not, we can't make it mandatory in any way, shape, or form, because then we would have been doing an underground regulation with it, and that we are not allowed to do. So the best we can do is say, oh, pay attention to this, there's some conversation around this. Meantime, we're keeping up with the modeling. That's gonna be one interesting letter to write to the districts. If that's the clarifying letter, that's going to be very interesting for you to write.
Sal?
Is there a possibility that we could, in this first 45-day period, find consensus possibly in those areas of these regs, in particular that define what is and what is not credible, and then consider looking at, which was more challenging of anything else, the issue of how you consistently treat that, and having that be a separate set of regulations, because that by its very nature allows for there to be some clear guidance on elements of these regs for districts to look at and begin to implement as they're dealing with contracts in the coming spring or preparing for people that are going to be retiring in the next 2 years, let's say, and then continue then to work on what seems to be the most difficult of all this, which is the issue of how you consistently treat, how you measure consistent treatment. Just I wanted to throw that out there and see if, what staff might think about that.
Thank you, Sal.
We had looked at that as an option of actually having two different rulemaking processes working in parallel, exactly along the lines of what Sal suggested. I think our conclusion was, that would create more complexity in terms of training employers about, we have to go out and train them about these rules that are taking effect, and then we have to go out again at some point shortly thereafter to do more training about these new rules that are in effect. If it came to that, I suppose we can make that decision at that time. I think we'd like to proceed with a single rulemaking just to try to get it all in place and sort of see how this develops.
Tom?
I just want to come back to Michael's point that I think in this era where we're kind of muddling our way through, as he earlier said, we ought to try and find a way to give clarity to our participating organizations that while this depends, to the extent people act in accordance with what's proposed, they won't be hurt. Now, it may be that they'll be out of sync and there'll have to be some adjustments as the regulations further evolve, but we don't want to put people in a damned if you do, damned if you don't posture. So we ought to look for some way to say that this is our best interpretation of the law as it now exists.
Dave? Thank you,
My
Tom.
concern, and I don't know that I expressed it clearly, is for those retired members who are members of STRS and they're out there and retired, who have to somewhat fear audits in light of the regulation problems that we have. I just plead with you to be very judicious about your audits and what you include and don't include, because that's not a comfortable feeling to be a retired member living out there and then suddenly find that you receive a letter that says you owe STRS so much, your allowance is going down. So I guess I'm pleading with you with those audits to be very judicious.
Thank you, Dave. So, Brian, we've had a couple members speak about a no harm, no foul type of language that we could include with the guide and directives, the philosophy of using the guides and directives during the rulemaking process. Are you comfortable with doing something? I mean, you understand what Michael's trying to.
I do. I understand very well. I'm a little bit, I'm not comfortable I mean, I'm certainly comfortable taking direction from the board. I'm not comfortable as we sit here today whether or not that would be a good thing to do before the end of the 45-day comment period. And the reason is because I'm expecting, certainly from the conversation today, that we would have significant comments, and that would be where we would make the most material changes to the draft regulation. And so I do think that, after that period, we may want to say, okay, this is, we're pretty sure that this represents our guidance and, subject to further comment. I just would be a little bit concerned because certainly from what I've heard there,
So perhaps it's
it's a
too
little,
early to put it in now.
it's unsettled. So and what I mean is the recipients or the folks that have to follow them are not yet clear on how they're going to end up, which I think is sort of built in the comment. So I think timing of that, but I do think that we should look at that and we should, I can certainly report back to you on my legal research. I'd be happy to do that.
All right. I think that we probably would. Is there consensus of the board of having Brian do that for us? Already. Ed?
Yeah, Ed Folia, CTA, NEA retired. Just want to make a comment. We talk about the regulations, we talk about implementation, and we want to make sure all the stakeholders are present. But when there is a screw up, and it does end up in your retirement check, the victims that are of the screw up usually had no part in what took place. And yet, many of our retirees are now going through audits and finding that they now have to pay back. And believe me, when you're on a fixed income, you're not getting Social Security, your husband passes away who has Social Security, you don't get any benefit, and then you get something from CalSTRS saying, somebody screwed up, but we got to make sure that you pay back. So, it's good to see that you are making some changes. But keep in mind that the people that have to pay in the long run for the screw-ups that take place are the retirees. And as I look up there isn't a retiree on the board. And there hasn't been a retiree on the board for 2 years. And I, for one, am up to here that we as retirees are political pawns. We happen to be one of the 5 that are appointed by the governor. And every governor for the last 10 years has used our position for political purposes. We had an appeal panel here just prior to this meeting. Was there a retiree up there on the panel? No. All of you have contacts with the governor. I spoke to the governor about 5 weeks ago about this issue. He told me, he said he didn't even know there was a vacancy. Now, I know he's made political appointments. See it all the time. I hope that each one of you, collectively and individually, let the governor know that it's time to get a retiree on the board so we can avoid some of the mistakes that are taking place that we have to pay for in our retirement. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. All righty. Interim process based on guide and directives. Pleasure of the board. We need to give Ed some direction.
I make a motion that.
Go ahead and click in.
I make a motion
Sharon?
that we use the interim process.
That
Based on
has
guides
been
and
recommended by staff. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion?
Just to be clear,
Right.
you said what's been as it's been recommended by staff.
Ed, will you repeat what your recommendation
We're
is?
recommending that in the interim that we would continue to utilize, that we would utilize the guide, the compensation guide and related directives as to how things would be reported before the effective date of the regulations. But it sounds like what Brian
But
was
I, but I
suggesting.
think Brian's suggestion
Right.
was to revisit
Yes.
the language that Michael wanted to put in after the first 45 days.
Right, we could visit that in the
Can we
February
edit
meeting.
that as a amendment?
I think they're harmonized because what we're really saying sort of an opt-in. So if we say we're going to apply what's the existing guidance that's out there, that's still consistent with what I've heard
Okay.
Michael and Tom talk about.
Sharon, you good?
Because then it would be an opt-in situation.
Alrighty, everybody with us? Alrighty, is there any further discussion then? All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed nay. Any abstentions? Alrighty. Ed, you got some marching papers.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, and thank you to the stakeholders and the members of the public that spoke up. We really appreciate that input also. Alrighty, moving on to the consent agenda. We have approval of the minutes and contracts requiring board approval. Those are items 3A and B. Is there anyone that would like to pull either one of those? If not, I'd entertain a motion to approve.
So moved.
It's been moved. Second? I'll say Harry moved it. You want to second it then, Michael? Alrighty, it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed nay. Any abstentions? All right, our consent agenda has been approved. We don't have any new items referred by committee. We don't have any review of information requests that we haven't already incorporated into a motion. Draft agenda is before you for our next meeting. Ed, or Jack, you want to go through that by any chance?
Well, really, we just have two significant issues we'll talk about. One is back on the funding of the system. We'll be doing some scenario building for you with Ed's group and Milliman, and will also be an item in closed session also around the funding issue. And then we'll have the public hearing around this regulation. So two significant issues.
I just want to think about how we want to manage the agenda for the rest of the day.
Okay. And then, are there any further comments from members of the public? Alrighty, seeing none, we will adjourn the board.